Hey Planeswalkers, this is Eric from Monk Punk Magic bringing you another deck tech video, and today we are talking about my Jeskai Flyers Commander deck, commanded by the all-new Radiant Serra Archangel, who is teaming up with Kraum, Ludovic's Opus. But before we begin, I'd just like to make a quick request. If you enjoy this video, hey, please hit that like button. I don't make money for making these videos, I'm not sponsored, but seeing that people enjoy watching them is inspiration enough for me to keep making more. So please hit that like button, I'd really appreciate it. Radiant is 6 and a white for a 6/4 angel with flying, and you can tap another untapped creature you control to give her protection from the color of your choice until the end of turn. Kraum is 3, a blue and a red for a 4/4 zombie horror with flying and haste, and whenever an opponent casts his or her second spell each turn, you get to draw a card. So I figured these two would make a great pairing for a Flyers deck, and they are both also threatening on their own. Serra with her high power and her additional evasion, and Kraum with haste, just gives us two very aggressive commanders. I love that Kraum can draw us cards and that he can be tapped to protect Radiant. So keep in mind that Radiant's ability does not have a tap symbol, so you can tap summoning sick creatures to activate it. One thing I thought was interesting is the spelling of the word Flyers. I was not exactly sure, so I checked a couple different dictionaries, but they all seemed torn. Even popular YouTube channels like MTG Goldfish and Jumbo Commander ended up spelling it differently. So when all else fails, I go to Grammarly. Grammarly is a pretty solid resource, and according to Grammarly, both ways are acceptable. So I've decided to spell it with a Y because that just feels more correct to me. So anyway, let's check out the deck breakdown. So this is my Jeskai Flyers deck. The potential power level I feel like could be all the way up to 8. The target that I'm going for is power level 7. There's no infinite combo in the deck. You could easily put one in, but I just didn't think there was any infinite combo that really fit the theme exactly. So the win condition for this deck is mainly just flying combat damage, but we also have Hellkite Tyrant, which can win the game on its own. Now every deck has room for improvement, so one area this deck might be able to improve upon is the mana curve of the creatures themselves. A lot of our creatures are expensive, including our commanders. We try to make up for that by including 15 ramp spells and 34 land. But the way that I see it is we can actually win the game with just a few big flying creatures all by themselves. They're just really hard for our opponents to deal with. So in total, we have 43 creatures, including our 2 commanders. We have 35 creatures with flying, including our 2 commanders. We have 18 total cards that can give us card advantage. We have 15 ramp spells, 13 removal spells. As of ways to increase the power of our creatures, we have 5 total. And that is important in a creature-based deck, but again, we also have evasion, so that plays a huge role in just ensuring we're going to be able to get through with combat damage, so it's not as important as it is in other decks, but you could put in more. We also have 10 ways that we can either give our creatures new abilities like vigilance or haste, or at least give them protection. We have 2 counterspells in the deck and 34 lands. So let's get into it, starting with the creatures. Serra Ascendant is 1 white for a 1/1 human monk with lifelink, and as long as you have 30 or more life, it gets +5/+5 and has flying. So this is potentially a 6/6 for 1 white mana, so this can be huge, and it's life gain. Next is Spectral Sailor, 1 blue for a 1/1 spirit pirate with flash, flying, and for 3 and a blue, you get to draw a card. So this is a little bit of card advantage. And flash, similar to haste, is great for ensuring that your creatures will be able to get damage through on 1 combat step, or you can cast it as a chump blocker. Next we have Cloudfin Raptor, 1 blue for a 0/1 bird mutant with flying and evolve. And so this creature just slowly gets humongous. I have seen this very frequently be a 5/6 or 6/7, you know, just bigger and bigger. I love it. Next, we got Watcher of the Spheres, 1 white and 1 blue for a 2/2 bird wizard with flying, and creatures with flying you cast cost 1 less to cast. And whenever another creature with flying enters the battlefield under your control, Watcher of the Spheres gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So all 3 of these creatures on the screen can be huge. Watcher of the Spheres is also ramp for flying creatures. Next, we got Skycat Sovereign, a white and a blue for a 1/1 elemental cat with flying. It gets +1/+1 for each other creature you control with flying, and for 2, a white and a blue, you can create a 1/1 cat bird creature token with flying. So this makes tokens, and it can be huge. Pride of the Clouds is very similar, a white and a blue for a 1/1 elemental cat with flying. It gets +1/+1 for each other creature you control with flying, and it has 4 casts, so it can make creature tokens, but only while it's in your hand. Next, we got Dockside Extortionist, 1 and a red for a 1/2 goblin pirate, and when it enters the battlefield, you make X treasure tokens, where X is the number of artifacts and enchantments your opponents control. I don't really need to explain this. This is just simply the best ramp spell in red in the entire game. Next is Selfless Spirit, 1 and a white for a 2/1 spirit cleric with flying, and you can sack it to give your creatures indestructible till the end of the turn. So this is just a great way to protect our board. Empyrean Eagle is 1 a white and a blue for a 2/3 bird spirit with flying, and it says other creatures you control with flying get +1/+1. So this is a way we're just going to power up our board. Next is Warden of Evos Isle, 2 and a blue for a 2/2 bird wizard with flying. Creature spells you have with flying cost 1 less to cast. So ramp. Next we got Linvala, Shield of Seagate, 1 a blue and a white for a 3/3 angel wizard with flying. And we don't have rogues, I don't think, in the deck. I don't think we're ever going to have a full party, so we can ignore that first paragraph. The last paragraph is what's important. You can sacrifice her to give all your creatures hexproof or indestructible. Next is Jubilant Skybonder, 1 and 2 hybrid white-blue for a 2/2 human wizard with flying. And it says creatures you control with flying have spells your opponents cast that target this creature cost 2 more to cast. This is a great way to protect our board. Next is Glasspool Mimic, a card that has nothing to do with the deck other than it can be a copy of one of our creatures, or we can choose to play it as a land. Next is Burnished Heart, 3 mana for a 2/2 elk that says you can pay 3 and tap and sacrifice it to search for 2 basic lands and put them on the battlefield tapped. This is just a great way to ramp in any deck that doesn't have green. Next we have Magus of the Moat, 2 and 2 white for a 0/3 human wizard, and it says creatures without flying can't attack. So this is a fabulous way to just lock down your opponents. They can't attack you at all unless they have flying, and yeah, just a great way to control the board, protect your life total. Next we got Jazal Goldmane, 2 and 2 white for a 4/4 cat warrior with first strike, and for 5 mana, attacking creatures you control get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of attacking creatures. So Jazal is a way we can finish the game. It can be huge. It's powering up our entire team. It's my budget version of like Craterhoof Behemoth in a lot of decks. Of course, we're not playing green, so this is one of the few choices we got in which we can just power up our entire team and close the game out. Next, we have Thunderclap Wyvern, 2 a blue and a white for a 2/3 Drake with flash and flying, and other creatures you control with flying get +1/+1. Powering up our team. Next is Heliod, God of the Sun, 3 and a white for a 5/6 legendary enchantment creature god with indestructible. As long as your devotion to white is less than 5, it's not a creature. Other creatures you control have vigilance, and for 2 and 2 white, you can make a 2/1 creature token. So this is in the deck because it can give all of our creatures vigilance. That is just so awesome. Being able to attack and block is just essential for closing out games with combat damage. So I think this is one of the best ways to give your creatures vigilance, and it also makes creature tokens. Next we have Battle Screech, 2 and 2 white. For a sorcery, you create 2 1/1 white bird creature tokens with flying, and has flashback by tapping 3 untapped white creatures you control. And again, it doesn't matter if those white creatures are summoning sick. So this is just a nice little army in a can, 4 creatures in 1 card. Next we have Anger, 3 and a red for a 2/2 incarnation with haste, and as long as Anger is in your graveyard and you control a mountain, creatures you control have haste. So this gives all your creatures haste. It's just one of the best ways to give your creatures haste. It's really hard for your opponents to deal with when it's in your graveyard. Next, we have Gisela and Bruna. So Gisela, the Broken Blade, is 2 and 2 white for a 4/3 Angel Horror with Flying, First Strike, and Lifelink. Bruna, the Fading Light, is 5 and 2 white for a 5/7 Angel Horror. And when you cast Bruna, you may return target angel or human creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So we got a few angels in the deck. There's also a couple humans in the deck. And at your end step, if you control both Bruna and Gisela, it turns into Brisella, Voice of Nightmares, that 9/10 flying first strike vigilance lifelink. Your opponents can't cast spells with converted mana cost 3 or less, badass motherfucker. Yeah, this is just an amazing flying creature. I love putting it in any deck I can. When you can actually flip it into Brisella, it's very hard for your opponents to deal with and can just, slaughter them. Next, we have Frenzied Saddlebrute, 4 and a red for a 5/4 Orc Warrior with haste, and it says all creatures can attack your opponents and planeswalkers your opponents control as though those creatures had haste. So Frenzied Saddlebrute is just one of the most amazing new ways to give your creatures haste, because it also gives everyone else haste, but only when they attack your opponents, right? It's just awesome. I love it. Next is Kongi Sky Warden. I think it's pronounced Kongi. 3, a white and a blue for a 3/3 bird wizard with flying and vigilance. Whenever Kongi attacks attacking creatures with flying, get +2/+0 until end of turn. And whenever he blocks blocking creatures with flying, get +0/+2 until end of turn. So a way to power up our team and give them higher toughness too when they're blocking. Next, we got Mull Drifter, 4 and a blue for a 2/2 elemental with flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw 2 cards, and you can cast it for its evoke cost to just get the 2 cards. So, card advantage on a creature. Next, we have Cloud Blazer, 3, a white and a blue for a 2/2 human scout with flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life and draw 2 cards. So, a little bit more card advantage, a little bit of life gain on a creature. Next, we have Niv Mizzet, Draco Genius, 2 blue and 2 red for a 5/5 dragon wizard with flying. Whenever it deals damage to a player, you may draw a card, and for a blue and a red, it deals 1 damage to target creature or player. So it's both removal and card advantage, just like Niv Mizzet Perrin, 3 blue, 3 red for a 5/5 dragon wizard. It can't be countered, it has flying. Whenever you draw a card, it deals 1 damage to any target, and whenever any player casts an instant or sorcery spell, you draw a card. So both of these can go infinite with a couple of enchantments. I think they're Ophidian Eye and something else. So if you want an easy infinite combo in the deck, look up the infinite combos that go infinite with Niv Mizzet. Again, I just didn't include any infinite combo in the deck because none seem to fit the theme of the deck. Next is Isperia, Supreme Judge, 2 white, 2 blue for a 6/4 Sphinx with flying, and whenever a creature attacks you or a planeswalker you control, you may draw a card. So, punishing people for attacking us. Next is Aurelia the War Leader, 2 red and 2 white for a 3/4 Angel with flying, vigilance, and haste. Whenever Aurelia attacks for the first time each turn, you untap all creatures you control and you get an additional combat phase. So extra combats, extra damage is how we can close out the game. Next is Consecrated Sphinx, 4 and 2 blue for a 4/6 Sphinx with flying, and whenever an opponent draws a card, you may draw 2 cards. This gets really stupid when there's 2 of them on the battlefield, right? Like, if someone else also controls one, then you can both just basically choose when you stop drawing cards, right? You draw 2, they draw 2, you draw 2, they draw 2. It just is never ending. Somebody just chooses to end it at some point. Next is Hellkite Tyrant, 4 and 2 red for a 6/5 dragon with flying and trample. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, gain control of all artifacts that player controls. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 20 or more artifacts, you win the game. So this is a way to steal our opponent's artifacts, effectively removing them, and it's also a win condition. It's mostly in here just as a way to get rid of our opponent's annoying artifacts, and it just obviously completely destroys artifact-themed decks. Next is Ryusei the Falling Star, 5 and a red for a 5/5 dragon spirit with flying. When it dies, it deals 5 damage to each creature without flying. So more removal on a creature that we can, beat some face with pretty well. Next is Angelic Skirmisher, 4 and 2 white for a 4/4 angel with flying. At the beginning of each combat, choose First Strike, Vigilance, or Lifelink. Creatures you control gain that ability until end of turn. So this just gives our creatures a new ability every turn, whichever one we need. I would say most of the time we'd actually be choosing Lifelink just to make sure that we can survive long enough to take everyone else out. Next is Runehorn Hellkite, 5 and a red for a 5/5 dragon with flying. And for 5 and a red, you can exile it from your graveyard and Wheel of Fortune. That can be card advantage. If you don't have a lot of cards in your hand, you just get a new hand of 7 cards. A nice budget wheel. Next is Nullspine Dragon, 5 and 2 red for a 7/5 dragon. When Nullspine Dragon comes into play, you may discard your hand and draw cards equal to the damage dealt to target opponent this turn. So if you dealt someone 10 damage, you could be drawing 10 cards off of this. Next is Saphara, Sky's Blade, 4 and 3 white. You get a 7/7 flying lifelink that says other creatures you control with flying have indestructible, and you may pay white and tap 4 untapped creatures you control with flying rather than paying this spell's mana cost. So you can get this out for potentially just 1 white mana, and again, it doesn't matter if those creatures are summoning sick. You can tap them even if they're summoning sick to help you cast Saphara. So this is a great way to protect our whole team, give them all indestructible. Next is Emiria's Call, 4 and 3 white for a sorcery that makes 2 4/4 Angel Warrior creature tokens with flying, and non-angel creatures you control gain indestructible until your next turn. So this is in the deck just because it either makes creatures and protects our team, or it's a land, either one. So kind of a why not. Next we have Emeria Shepherd, 5 and 2 white for a 4/4 angel with flying, and it has landfall, so whenever a land enters under your control, you may return target non-land permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. If that land is a plains, you may return that non-land permanent card to the battlefield instead. So this is normally getting us a creature back, actually can get us any permanent we want back from our graveyard, and so this is a good reason to include fetch lands and anything that's a dual land that has the plains type in its type, so that you can trigger Emeria Shepherd. Next is Gisela, Blade of Gold Knight. She is 4, a red and 2 white for a 5/5 angel with flying and first strike, and she says, if a source would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, that source deals double damage to that permanent or that player instead. And if a source would deal damage to you or a permanent you control, prevent half that damage rounded up. So keep in mind the second paragraph is worded in a special way that it's not saying it deals half that damage to you rounded up. It's you're preventing half that damage rounded up. So if something's only dealing 1 damage to you, it's completely prevented because half of 1 rounded up is 1. And so Gisela would prevent every instance of 1 damage that's being dealt to you. A lot of players get it wrong and they think the amount of damage that's being dealt is halved rounded up, but it's the opposite. The amount of damage that's being prevented is halved rounded up, making Gisela a really badass mofo. Like, she is a way that you can close the game out if you have a lot of creatures out, dealing double damage to everything. Even your opponents are dealing double damage to each other. But more importantly, the fact that all damage dealt to you and permanents you control is halved is just ridiculous. Like, it is very hard to deal with your board all of a sudden. It's very hard to kill you all of a sudden. She's just awesome. I love her. Any deck with red-white, I really do try to include her. Next we have Stormtide Leviathan, 5 and 3 blue for an 8/8 Leviathan with Island Walk, and it says all lands are islands in addition to their other types, and creatures without flying or Island Walk can't attack. So again, a way to lock down our opponent's creatures, giving us protection. Also kind of helps fix our mana if we need blue mana, turning all lands into islands. A very cool way to make sure that mostly only your creatures are attacking. Alright, so those were the creatures. Now we got some ways to power up the creatures so we can, close out the game. Akroma's Will is 3 and a white for an instant. You choose 1. If you control a commander, as you cast this spell, you may choose both. So it goes really well in any deck with 2 commanders. And so you either choose creatures you control gain flying, vigilance, and double strike until end of turn, or Creatures you control gain lifelink, indestructible, and protection from all colors until end of turn. So this is life gain, it's giving them evasion with that protection effect, and this is just game ending by giving all of your creatures double strike, on top of the fact that they already all have flying, or you can just give all the rest of them flying too with this same card. I mean, this card is just sweet. I really love this card. I'm going to put it in a lot of decks. Next is McKindy Stampede, 3 and 2 white to give creatures you control +2/+2 till the end of the turn. This is just in the deck because you can either use it to power up or it's a land. Alright, next we got some ramp. I don't really need to explain these cards on the screen. I got Soul Ring and I got the Signets. Next we got Thematic Compass, 2 mana for an artifact. It says you can pay 3 and tap it to search your library for a basic land and put it into your hand. And at the beginning of your end step, if you control 7 or more lands, you can transform it into Spires of Erazka, which can tap for colorless, or you can tap it to untap target attacking creature an opponent controls and remove it from combat. So this is kind of like ramp at first. It does eventually turn into a land, so it is basically ramp, and it's fixing your mana, it's making sure you're hitting your land drop, and it's protection from your opponent's most threatening creature. Next is Oath of Lieges, 1 and a white for an enchantment. During each player's upkeep, if that player controls fewer lands than target opponent, the player may search his or her library for a basic land card and put that land into play. The player shuffles his or her library afterwards. I really love this in Commander. It's like land tax for everyone, but even better because they get to put the land directly onto the battlefield, and it works for everyone except for the person who has the most lands, right? So if someone is ramping out like crazy, this gives everyone else the opportunity to catch up to them. That person is normally the threat anyway, so I don't really mind giving the other players the opportunity to catch up, and if it can score me some points with those players, that's awesome too. Next is Treasure Map, 2 mana for an artifact. It says you can pay 1 and tap it to scry 1, and then it gets a landmark counter. And when there are 3 or more landmark counters on it, you remove those counters and transform it into Treasure Cove, which is a land that taps for colorless, or you can tap it and sacrifice a treasure to draw a card. This is kind of like both ramp or card advantage, right? It gives you the treasures, it gives you a land, and you can sacrifice the treasures to draw cards. Smothering Tithe is 3 and a white for an enchantment. Whenever an opponent draws a card, that player may pay 2. If they don't, you get a treasure token. So this is just one of the best ways to ramp really quickly in any deck that has white. Just one of the best white ramp spells. Gotta include it. Next we got some ways we get card advantage. Ponder is 1 blue for a sorcery. You look at the top 3 cards of your library, put them back in any order, and draw a card. Culling Dais is 2 mana for an artifact that you can tap to sacrifice a creature and put a charge counter on it, and you can pay 1 and sacrifice it to draw a card for each charge counter on it. So this is a sacrifice outlet that also eventually can get us more cards in our hand. I like having a sacrifice outlet in almost any creature-based deck because it prevents our opponents from gaining control of our creatures, from making copies of our creatures, from exiling our creatures, from enchanting our creatures, and yeah, Culling Dais just also has the upside of eventually being able to draw us extra cards. And of course we gotta include Rhystic Study. Next is Keep Watch, 2 and a blue for an instant. You draw a card for each attacking creature. We do have a lot of creatures in this deck, but we can also use this on opponents' turns, so as long as somebody is attacking with a bunch of creatures, we're gonna draw a bunch of cards. Next is Valakut Awakening, 2 and a red for an instant. Put any number of cards from your hand on the bottom of your library, then draw that many cards +1. So it's either card advantage or a land. It's like a wheel where you select exactly the cards you want to get rid of. You draw that many +1. This is actually a really sweet card. I love it. Next we have Seagate Restoration, 4 and 3 blue for a sorcery. Draw cards equal to the number of cards in your hand +1, and then you have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. So it's either card advantage or a land. Then we got a couple of counterspells. My personal favorites are Swan Song and Counterspell. Next we got a couple of ways of protection. Next we got a couple of forms of protection. Bane Veil is 1 and a blue for an instant to give creatures your opponents control -2/-0 until the end of turn, or you can choose to play this as a land. And then of course we are also running Teferi's Protection, which also protects tokens and our life total and everything. It's just fabulous. Gotta have it. And then we get into the removal. So of course we're going to run Swords to Plowshares. Next is Cabrilla Takedown, 1 and a white for an instant. It deals damage equal to the number of creatures you control to target creature or planeswalker. This is just in here because it's either removal or a land, so it's kind of a why not. We do have a lot of creatures, so it makes sense. Then we got, of course, Cyclonic Rift. I don't need to explain that, but I will say I like to use Cyclonic Rift on my opponent's end steps right before they go to discard, so then after I bounce everything, they have to discard down to 7. Next is Kazul's Fury, 2 and a red for an instant. As an additional cast to cost this spell, you have to sacrifice a creature, and it deals damage equal to the sacrificed creature's power to any target. So this is either a fling or a land. Right? Nice way to just deal the extra damage when you need it, or play it as a land. Next, we got some spells that only hit creatures without flying, essentially a one-sided board wipe except for a few creatures in our deck. Subterranean Tremors is X and a red for a sorcery. It deals X damage to each creature without flying. If X is 4 or more, you also destroy all artifacts. If X is 8 or more, you also put an 8/8 red lizard creature token onto the battlefield. So this is potentially 3 different spells in one. I love it. Next is Earthquake, X and a red for a sorcery, deals X damage to each creature without flying and each player. Fault Line is X and 2 red. For an instant, it deals X damage to each creature without flying and each player. I love that this one's instant speed. Next we have Magma Quake, X and 2 red for another instant that deals X damage to each creature without flying and each player. Having these with instant speed is something you do not overlook. Hold them up, use them at the right time. Make it tricky, right? Get tricky with it. Next we have Blasphemous Act, 8 and a red for a sorcery. The spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature on the battlefield, and it deals 13 damage to each creature. So potentially a board wipe for just 1 red mana. And then we have 34 lands. The only ones really worth mentioning are Desolate Lighthouse, which, is like looting on a land, and Myriad Landscape, which is like ramp on a land. And again, like I said, for the Emeria Shepherd, we want to include plains and land types that have plains in them. And that's it. That's my Radiant and Kraum Jeskai Flyers deck. So let me know what you think in the comments below. What would you change and what would you take out? If you enjoy this video, please hit that like button. I would really appreciate it. This is Eric from Punk Magic signing off. Until next time, take care, take it easy.